Welcome back, Sociology droids. You ready to get your gears turning?
Always.
Today, we're going to go deep on a classic, one that's been on our list for a while. Arlie Hochschild's The Managed Heart.
It's a big one.
Oh, it is. It's one of those books that kind of just reshaped how we think about emotions.
Yeah, it really shifted things.
And I think for anyone in sociology, especially grad students, you gotta grapple with Hochschild's ideas.
Absolutely. And for our deep dive today, we've got some really juicy excerpts and notes to dig into.
Oh, yeah, we're going to pull apart some quotes, see what makes this book tick right.
Let's do it. So, at its core, The Managed Heart is about this idea that emotions aren't just these private things we experience, but they're also social.
Okay, yeah, I think we all kind of intuitively get that, but
Yeah.
Hochschild really lays it out systematically.
Right. And she even takes it a step further by saying that emotions can become a form of labor.
Okay, well, hold on. Emotions as labor. Break that down for me.
So think about it like this. We all have these expectations for how we're supposed to feel in different situations, right?
Sure, like you don't show up to a funeral cracking jokes.
Exactly. There are these unwritten rules, feeling rules, as Hochschild calls them.
Okay, feeling rules. I like that.
Yeah.
It's like there's a social script for our emotions.
Yeah, and when we manage our feelings to fit those rules, when we put in effort to feel, or at least appear to feel a certain way, that's emotional labor.
So it's not just about feeling happy or sad. It's about the work that goes into shaping those feelings to meet social expectations.
Exactly. Hochschild gives this great example of a bride who's actually unhappy about the marriage, but forces herself to appear joyful on her wedding day.
Oh, man, that's got to be tough putting on a brave face like that.
Right, and that effort to conform to the feeling rules around weddings, that's emotion work, a form of emotional labor.
But how does this go from private emotion work to, like, actual labor that we sell?
Well, think about jobs where you're expected to manage your emotions as part of the service you provide.
Okay, I'm seeing where you're going with this. Like customer service, right? You got to be all smiles even when dealing with a jerk.
Exactly.
Or think about therapists. They got to create that safe, empathetic space.
Right. And Hochschild dives deep into one profession in particular, flight attendants.
Ah, yeah, the Smile School graduates.
She spent a lot of time researching them, analyzing their training manuals, conducting interviews.
Wow, so not just reading about it, she actually went out into the field to study this.
Oh yeah, her methodology was very hands-on. She wanted to understand the lived experience of emotional labor.
That's so cool. So she wasn't just theorizing about it, she was getting right in there, experiencing it firsthand.
Absolutely.
I'm guessing that led to some pretty interesting data.
Oh, tons of it. She collected a lot of qualitative data, anecdotes from flight attendants, observations. She even went through flight attendant training herself.
No way.
Yeah, to really get into the nitty-gritty of those feeling rules and emotional labor demands.
That's dedication to research. I'm curious, what kind of stuff did she find? Any examples that stick out?
One that comes to mind is a quote from a flight attendant describing a passenger who needed constant reassurance.
Oh, I can imagine, especially if they're afraid of flying.
Yeah, this passenger saw himself as a victim of fear of flying and really expected the flight attendant to cater to his every need.
Oh, wow. So not just a nervous flyer, but someone who really put the emotional burden on the attendant.
Exactly. And Hochschild uses this example to illustrate the often invisible demands placed on workers in these types of roles.
It makes you wonder how they do it day in and day out.
Right.
And I remember she compares the flight attendant with another profession that really struck me, the bill collector.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
It is. It's like night and day in terms of emotional approach, right?
Totally. The flight attendant's all about creating a calm and pleasant experience.
Soothing those anxieties, putting on that friendly face.
Right, whereas the bill collector is, well, not so much. Their goal is to extract payment, often using tactics that can be pretty forceful.
Yeah, I'd imagine guilt trips and maybe even some, well, I don't want to say threats, but
It's definitely a different emotional toolbox. And Hochschild uses this contrast to highlight how the goals of a profession shape the type of emotional labor involved.
that's so fascinating. It's like the feeling rules change depending on the job.
Exactly.
And it makes you think, are there good and bad ways to manage emotions? Or is it all just situational?
That's a great question, and one that Hochschild grapples with throughout the book. She argues that this kind of strategic emotion management is becoming more and more common, especially in the service industry.
It's almost like our feelings are becoming commodified, something to be bought and sold.
Right. And she argues that this can have some pretty serious consequences, both for individual workers and for society as a whole.
Okay, I'm really intrigued now.
It gets deep.
Lay it on me.
Uh,
So we're really getting into the nuts and bolts here of how emotions are, well, they're not just these personal things.
right. They're shaped by our interactions and expectations and all these power dynamics swirling around us.
Yeah, we were talking about how women are often channeled into these jobs that demand a ton of emotional labor, like those caretaking roles.
Exactly. And it's not just about women being naturally better at it, like some people might say.
Oh, I know that line. Oh, women are just more nurturing.
Right. It's like, no, there's something deeper going on here. Hochschild argues it's about how we structure work, how we value different types of skills.
So those feminized jobs, they're often underpaid, undervalued, even though they require some serious emotional heavy lifting.
Exactly. And it gets back to this idea of commodifying emotions, like when we have to sell our feelings as part of a service, it kind of cheapens them in a way.
It's like, okay, be happy, be helpful, be empathetic, but we're not going to pay you much for it because, hey, it's just what you ladies do naturally,
Yeah,
right?
it's messed up, right? And it feeds into this bigger pattern that Hochschild points out. Women have historically held less economic power, so they've often used emotional labor as a way to negotiate relationships, especially with men.
Like a kind of bargaining chip.
Exactly. A way to get support or resources when other avenues are blocked.
I'm seeing the connections here, how this stuff plays out in families, workplaces, even just walking down the street.
It's everywhere. And Hochschild gives some really vivid examples from her research. Like, think about holiday dinners. Who's usually the one making sure everyone's happy, smoothing over any drama, keeping the peace?
Okay, yeah, I'm usually trying to sneak an extra slice of pie, not keeping the peace.
Yeah.
But I see your point.
And it's not just family stuff. In the workplace, think about nurses, teachers, social workers.
Yeah, all those jobs where women are overrepresented and the emotional demands are through the roof.
And guess what? They're often not compensated or respected in the same way as, say, a CEO or a surgeon.
It's like we're saying those emotional skills, that empathy, that caregiving, it's just that expected. So no need to reward it, right?
Ugh, it's so frustrating. And Hochschild doesn't shy away from calling out this double standard. She's like, hey, this is connected to gender roles, to how we've historically undervalued women's work.
So it's not just about women doing more emotional labor. It's about the kind of emotional labor they're often expected to do.
Bingo. And she contrasts this with the emotional labor that's often more valued in, say, male-dominated professions. Remember our bill collector friend?
Oh yeah, the master of using guilt to get that payment.
Right. And while we might not like those tactics, they're often seen as more, I don't know, powerful, assertive.
It's almost like we have different scripts for how men and women are allowed to express their emotions.
Absolutely. And this gets ingrained in us from a young age. Think about that old chestnut, boys don't cry.
Oof, yeah, that's some heavy societal programming right there.
And those messages, they stick with us. Hochschild observes this in workplaces, like how women's anger is often seen as hysterical, while a man expressing anger might be seen as a strong leader.
It's a double standard for sure.
Mhm.
Women are expected to be emotionally controlled, but not too controlled and definitely not angry.
Right. And she argues that this double standard, it keeps women down. It limits their opportunities, undermines their authority. It's about power, not just personality.
Okay, so individual emotions, they're tangled up with these bigger structures. Gender, power, economic systems.
Exactly. It's not just about feeling happy or sad. It's about who gets to express what, when, and how, and what happens when those expressions don't fit the script.
Wow, this is really making me think about how we navigate our own emotional lives.
It's eye-opening stuff, right?
And I'm guessing this all ties back to that search for authenticity we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. When we're constantly managing and manipulating our emotions for work, for social acceptance, it can become hard to know what we really feel.
Like, is this my genuine feeling or am I just performing for the audience?
Exactly. And Hochschild warns us about the consequences of this kind of emotional dissonance.
Burnout, feeling disconnected.
All of that and more. It can affect our relationships, our sense of self, even our ability to engage politically.
Man, this is heavy stuff. Hochschild's not just analyzing emotions, she's unpacking the very fabric of our social lives.
She's a rock star, and she's doing it with such rigor and insight, really digging into the nitty-gritty of how our emotional lives are shaped and, yeah, sometimes exploited.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the big ideas here, but I think it's time to get into the nitty-gritty ourselves.
Yeah, let's dive into some specific examples, some quotes, really get a feel for how Hochschild brings these concepts to life.
Sounds good to me. Droids will be right back with more from the Managed Heart. Okay, droids, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the Managed Heart. It's been a lot to process, right?
Oh, absolutely. Hochschild's work, it's dense, but it's so rewarding to really dig into these ideas about how emotions are, well, they're not just personal.
Right. We've been talking about how they're social, how they're shaped by these expectations and power structures, and even become a form of labor, especially for women.
And I think it's important to remember that Hochschild isn't just making the stuff up. Her arguments are grounded in solid research.
Yeah, she's got the receipts, right? All those interviews with flight attendants, the training manuals, the observations of social interactions. She really went deep.
Exactly. So let's get into some of the specific examples that illustrate her points. Bring this stuff to life.
Love it. I'm ready for some juicy quotes.
Okay, well, there's this one passage that always sticks with me, where Hochschild is talking about how flight attendants are trained to deal with a passenger who's having a panic attack.
Oh man, that's got to be tough.
Right. And she writes, the passenger is not to be treated as ill, but in a sense, as wrong. He's not to be comforted, but to be persuaded or even bullied out of his fear.
Whoa, that's intense. It's like the flight attendant's job isn't really to care for the passenger, but to manage the situation, keep things running smoothly.
Exactly. And this gets at the heart of what Hochschild's arguing about emotional labor, that it's often about controlling or manipulating emotions rather than genuinely expressing them.
And she connects this to the commodification of feelings, right? It's like we're selling our emotions, putting on a performance for the customer.
Exactly. And that can take a toll. Remember that quote from the flight attendant who felt like she was putting on a show all the time?
Yeah, she said something like, I have to smile and act cheerful even when I feel exhausted or frustrated. It's like I'm living a double life.
Right. And that constant pressure to perform a certain emotional role, it can lead to this sense of detachment, a feeling of not even knowing what you're genuinely feeling anymore.
It's like you're alienated from your own emotions.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing this isn't just a problem for flight attendants, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Hochschild argues that this is happening in all sorts of professions, especially those caretaking jobs you were talking about earlier.
The ones that are often undervalued and, wouldn't you know it, dominated by women.
Exactly. So it's not just about individual workers feeling burned out or inauthentic. It's about this systemic undervaluing of emotional labor and how it's often tied to gender and power dynamics.
Okay, so this is heavy stuff for sure. But what do we do with all this? What's the takeaway?
Well, I don't think Hochschild is giving us a step-by-step guide to fixing these problems. It's more about raising awareness, starting a conversation, encouraging us to think critically about how our emotions are being shaped and managed and sometimes exploited.
Right, it's like she's saying, hey, wake up. This stuff is happening all around you and it's time to start paying attention.
Exactly. And to start asking tough questions like, how can we create workplaces that value and respect emotional labor? How can we challenge those gendered double standards around emotions? How can we reclaim our own authenticity in a world where our feelings are constantly being commodified?
Those are some big questions for sure.
They are, but they're important ones. And I think Hochschild's work gives us a framework for starting to grapple with them.
Well said. Droids, we've covered a lot of ground today, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Hochschild's The Managed Heart. It's one of those books that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
It makes you see the world differently. It makes you question things you might have taken for granted.
And hopefully, it inspires us to do better, to create a world where our emotions are valued, respected, and nurtured, not just managed or manipulated.
Absolutely.
So keep those critical circuits firing, droids. And until next time.
Keep feeling, keep thinking, keep questioning.